All right, this time we're going to dig a little deeper into our React application here, and from the import statements to the export statements. So recall that this is JavaScript now, modern JavaScript and using JavaScript modules. So import React from React. Since this is a node module, and here I have the node modules folder open, it's huge here. And since it's a node module, React, it's one of the dependencies that was installed, of course, by the Create React app. When we finally get down to the R's, we see React. So if it comes from the node module, you don't have to use you don't use a relative path. Here we import the logo resource and then the app.css, the local CSS for this component. And here we get to a functional component. In a bit, we're going to see a class component, but this is a simple component. The simplest component in React is a function component. Its requirements are relatively simple. It has to have an uppercase letter to begin with, then a function body that has a return statement. That's really it. And that makes it a functional component. Uppercase letter is really the key here. And it returns JSX, which in turn gets handed to Babel, which converts it into JavaScript with React DOM calls, as we saw in our previous manually built examples. Then we export this. Notice it's a default export. So recall that default exports are intended for single exports from a file, and that's what's happening here. We export this. Then over in our root.js element, index.js, we see the reference to this. It's imported here. Import app. So if it wasn't the default export, this would have to be required in curly braces. But because it's a default export, we can import it directly here from app. And this is a relative path. That's also required here since it's a local import. Since app is also default export, this is really the local name for it. It's a little bit strange and not entirely desirable, but I could call this anything I wanted to. Let's just call it AP with one letter. So that's my local name for it. When I save the file, it still works. Right? Now this will break because the local name is broken. All right. So we see the generated file with the function component exporting its default app. Let's manually build a component. So I'll go to source folder and do new file. I'm going to call it plain.js. So I've opened up my the hand-built React example that we did earlier, and I'm going to copy this class here and get it working hopefully over in our manually built component over here. So I'm going to take that, copy it over here, and we have that here. The next thing we need to do is import React. So at the top of the file here, we'll do our import statement. Import React default component. Now we're going to actually need another component that's going to come from React. It's called component. And then from React. Okay. So we're importing this as a component here. So we need to, since we're doing a direct import here, we no longer need to call it out this way. This is fussing, I think, because it's unused. Declared but never used. And this is fussing actually because image elements must have an alt property. So it's insisting actually on an alt property when it didn't earlier before, but here it is. So we're going to have the alt property here. And recall alt property is the alternate display text in case the image can't be found. I'll give it a plain. And I'm going to delete these other two elements. That was just to illustrate the DOM render nature, and we've already gone over that. So we have this relatively simple div with an H2 element inside and an image element. And also remember, when we return this, what's a JSX component that gets then rendered into JavaScript, we can only return one component. So the div is our root element, and it contains children, but we're returning one element. We couldn't, say, have a sibling div here and return that as well. You can only return a single element. So we have this component. Looks like I'm missing a curly brace here. And then the last thing we need to do is export. So we're going to have the export statement, and we're going to use a default export, and we'll export plain. Okay. If I had a list of exports to do, I'd put curly braces here, and it wouldn't be the default export anymore. Right? You could export it any way you want to. I think you could also put recall export on this class here. Right? I prefer the list down here, and since it's the default export, we'll use it that way. Now, the use of it over here in index.js. So we need to import it. So we'll write our import statement, and we'll just follow the example for app here. Plain from quotes, and then plain. Here. So now we save that file. We're going to fix our error here. So reading the text over here, identifier plain has already been declared. I worked up this example already, so we already have our import statement here, and so we don't need to do it twice, and that's our error. Let's save this. And this is fussing because it's not used. Let's import. Here we got another error. Let's fix that. And this is actually in our plain component, so let's look at what's happening here. So I think I have an extra curly brace. Hit Alt-Shift-F to format. Okay. Now we should have that. And we're happy again. We're not using it yet, so we see our original page, but that's our next step. So now we need to just call out our component. Instead of calling out app, and we see this one's fussing at us because it's unused, if we call out our app here, plain instead, we should have it. There it is. So let's review that once again. I'm going to compress my folders here, or collapse node modules. Get that out of the way. And here we have the plain.js that we manually added to this system. We first created an empty file. I copied over this class component from our manually built example from earlier. Fixed up the import statement, so we import React and then component. React is the default export from React, and component is a non-default export. So that's why we put it in curly braces here. We have a class component instead of a functional component, so we extend component, and then we have to have a render method. So you can get the idea that we're probably overriding the render method of component. That in turn returns JSX, which gets compiled down in by Babel into React DOM elements, and then they're run, as we see here. We export it, and then we can use it. So we've manually created now a JavaScript React component. Thank you.